Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in the Virginia tidewater in the year 1607. The air is thick with salt and pine. Somewhere behind you, a handful of English settlers are starving inside a rotting wooden fort, convinced they have stumbled onto the edge of paradise. And somewhere in the darkness ahead of you, the most powerful indigenous leader in eastern North America is watching. He already knows everything about you. He has known since the moment your ship entered the bay, and he has not yet decided whether to feed you or destroy you. His name is Wahunsenacah. The English will call him Powhatan, and the decision he makes in the next few months will reshape an entire continent. But here is what almost no history class ever tells you. The real weapon Powhatan used against the English was not arrows or fire. It was something far more sophisticated. It was his understanding of how families work, how alliances are built through blood and marriage, how a man who controls the bonds between people controls everything. Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we are diving into the hidden world of the Powhatan Confederacy, and specifically into the marriage customs, social structures, and political genius that made Wahunsenacah one of the most formidable leaders the early Americas ever produced. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we do not do surface-level history on this channel. We go deep. Let us get into it. To understand Powhatan marriage, you first have to understand the society it came from. And that society was built on a foundation that would have been completely alien to any Englishman stepping off a ship in 1607. The Powhatan Confederacy was not a single tribe. It was a complex political alliance of roughly 30 Algonquian-speaking groups stretched across the tidewater region of what is now Virginia, controlling territory around the Chesapeake Bay. Wahunsenacah, the paramount chief, presided over this network from his capital at Wahunsenacah, positioned strategically on the York River with sight lines across the water in multiple directions. This was not an accident. Everything about Powhatan society was deliberate, and at the heart of that deliberateness was a matrilineal system of descent. In Powhatan culture, your lineage, your inheritance, your identity, all of it traced through your mother, not your father. When a man died, his property and his position did not pass to his sons. They passed through the female line. A chief's successor was more likely to be his brother or his sister's son than his own child. This single fact reshapes everything you think you know about how power worked in this society. Now, here's the question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. If women controlled the line of descent, if every child belonged to the mother's clan, if inheritance flowed through female blood, then what was marriage actually for? Because it clearly was not about the same things the English thought it was for. And the answer to that question tells you something astonishing about Powhatan political strategy. But before we get there, let us talk about what a Powhatan marriage actually looked like on the ground, in practice, day by day. Marriage in Powhatan society was not a romantic institution in the European sense. It was an economic and social contract, carefully negotiated, with real stakes for both families involved. Courtship was formal. It began with a man presenting food gifts to a woman he was interested in. This was not just a gesture. It was a demonstration of capacity. It said, I can provide, I can hunt, I can sustain a household. I am a viable partner for the community's survival. Women retained the right to decline. This is a point that English observers frequently glossed over or missed entirely, because it did not fit their assumptions about indigenous peoples. But Powhatan women were not simply handed from one family to another. A woman's acceptance of a proposal required her own consent and the approval of her parents. Both had to say yes before anything moved forward. Once a match was agreed upon, the real negotiation began. The Powhatan marriage system involved something called bride wealth, and it is important to understand that this is fundamentally different from a dowry. A dowry in the European tradition was wealth that a bride's family gave to the groom's family. Bride wealth worked the opposite way. The groom, or his family, paid the bride's family a negotiated sum. The logic was explicit. The bride's family was losing her labor, her contribution to their household economy, her hands in the fields, her knowledge of food preparation and craft. That loss had real material value. The bride wealth was compensation. This reframes the entire transaction. The Powhatan marriage system was not about selling a daughter. It was about formally acknowledging her economic worth. After the bride wealth was agreed upon and paid, the ceremony itself was held at the bride's home. It involved the exchange of gifts, the joining of hands, and one strikingly poetic ritual, the breaking of a chain of shell beads over the couple's heads. Those shell beads, called wampum or similar forms of shell currency, were among the most valuable objects in Powhatan material culture. Breaking them over the couple was a statement. It said, "This union is worth more than wealth. What is being created here cannot be measured." Now hold that image in your mind, because I want to come back to it, because there is a dramatic tension buried inside that ceremony, and it has everything to do with what happens when first marriages end and additional marriages begin. First marriages in Powhatan society were intended to be lifelong commitments, but additional marriages were a different matter entirely. And this is where Powhatan's social structure gets genuinely complex and genuinely fascinating, because polygamy was not just permitted, it was a language. It was how powerful men communicated their status and built their political networks. Ordinary Powhatan men could take additional wives if, and only if, they could demonstrate the ability to provide for them. This was not a casual decision. It required real material wealth, the capacity to feed, house, and support multiple households. A man with 2 wives was a man of means. A man with 3 was a man of significant standing. But a paramount chief like Wahunsenacah, operated on an entirely different scale. According to William Strachey, secretary of the Virginia Company of London and one of the more detailed English observers of Powhatan society, Wahunsenacah may have had over 100 wives across his lifetime. 100. When English colonists first heard this number, they treated it as evidence of savagery, of excess, of moral chaos. They completely missed the point. Think about the geography of the Powhatan Confederacy. 30 or more distinct tribal groups, each with their own leadership, their own loyalties, their own interests. How do you hold that together? How do you create durable alliances across dozens of communities spread across thousands of square miles of tidewater, river, and forest? You marry into them. Each wife Wahunsenacah took from a different town or tribal group, created a web of in-law relationships. Her family became his allies. Her children became future diplomatic assets. Wahunsenacah was not being indulgent. He was being systematic. His marriage network was his foreign policy. And here is something Strachey noted that makes this even more striking. Wahunsenacah's practice was to keep a wife until she bore him a child, at which point she would return to her home community, often with gifts and elevated status, while he moved on to establishing the next alliance through the next marriage. The children remained connected to both parents, creating a generation of political children, offspring who were part of his lineage, and simultaneously embedded in communities across the Confederacy. His wives were not passive figures in this arrangement either. Strachey and other English observers noted that Powhatan's wives were expected to be accomplished. They raised corn, prepared food, managed households, and when receiving visitors, they were expected to present themselves with furs, jewelry, and elaborate face paint. They were representatives of the paramount chief's prestige. Their labor was real, their social function was clear, and their status within their home communities appears to have been elevated by the connection. Now I want to pause here and ask you something directly. When you hear a leader building alliances through strategic marriages, managing a network of relationships across a vast political territory, using family bonds as diplomatic infrastructure, does that sound like a man without sophistication? Or does that sound like a man running one of the most complex political operations in early 17th century North America? Let me know what you think in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your read on this, because the English who showed up in Jamestown in 1607 had almost no framework for understanding what they were looking at. And that gap in understanding would cost both sides enormously. The English colonists arrived with a specific set of assumptions about civilization, about marriage, about gender, about power. They assumed that real governance looked like what they knew: kings, courts, written law, Christian sacraments. What they encountered in Powhatan society did not match any of those templates, and so they defaulted to dismissing it. Captain John Smith is the figure most associated with the early Jamestown period, and he is one of the most complicated and unreliable narrators in American colonial history. Smith was intelligent, brave, and extraordinarily self-promotional. His accounts of his interactions with Wahunsenacah are filtered through his own need to appear heroic, and they should be read with significant skepticism. What we do know is that the early relationship between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy followed a pattern that Wahunsenacah had almost certainly used before with other newcomers: cautious hostility followed by an attempt at incorporation. The paramount chief's initial strategy with the English was not elimination, it was assimilation. He wanted to bring them into the Confederacy's orbit, to make them dependent, and to eventually integrate them as one more tributary group who would contribute goods and labor to his network. The English focused almost entirely on finding gold and extracting instant wealth, were completely uninterested in integration. They were not planting crops, not building sustainable food supplies, and were becoming increasingly desperate for provisions. Smith's solution was to trade with the Powhatan communities, but when trade negotiations failed, he resorted to force, taking food by threat at gunpoint. This was a profound cultural insult that Smith appears never to have fully grasped. Wahunsenacah, watching all of this, reached a moment of clarity around 1609. The English were not going to leave. They were not going to become part of his confederacy. They were not going to reciprocate hospitality or engage in the marriage alliances that would have signaled real commitment to the land and its people. They were occupiers. And from that point forward, the strategy shifted. Powhatan communities began attacking settlers, destroying livestock, burning crops. Wahunsenacah publicly disclaimed control over the young men, doing this, framing himself as a leader, unable to restrain his warriors. But this was sophisticated political theater. The attacks were coordinated. The paramount chief knew exactly what was happening. The uneasy truce that eventually followed came through the most famous Powhatan figure in history, a young woman the English called Pocahontas. Her real name was Amonute, and she also carried the more private name, Matrilineal. Pocahontas was a childhood nickname, meaning something roughly like playful one, or ill-behaved child, a term of affection, not a formal identity. She was the daughter of Wahunsenacah, and like all daughters of the paramount chief, she was a political asset. In 1613, English colonist Samuel Argall captured Pocahontas and brought her to Jamestown as a hostage. Her captivity was used to pressure Wahunsenacah into returning English prisoners and weapons. What happened next is one of those genuinely strange moments where individual human emotion cuts across political calculation in ways that cannot be fully predicted or explained. While held in English custody, Pocahontas converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and developed a relationship with tobacco planter John Rolfe. In 1614, with the approval of both Wahunsenacah and Colonial Governor Sir Thomas Dale, she and Rolfe married. From Wahunsenacah's perspective, this was not a betrayal. It was, in fact, entirely consistent with his political logic. His daughter was now embedded in the English power structure through exactly the kind of marriage alliance he had been using for decades to knit together his confederacy. The English had finally, accidentally, done the thing he had been waiting for them to do. The marriage of Pocahontas and Rolfe produced a genuine peace between Jamestown and the Powhatan Confederacy that lasted several years. She traveled to England in 1616 as a diplomatic figure, was received at the court of King James, and died in 1617 at Gravesend, England, before she could return home. She was approximately 21 years old. Wahunsenacah died the following year, in 1618. And without his particular genius for holding the Confederacy together, the political architecture he had spent decades building through strategic marriage, through bride wealth negotiations, through the careful management of family alliances across 30 tribal groups, began to fracture. What followed was decades of open warfare between the Powhatan peoples and the expanding English colonial presence, culminating in the effective destruction of the Confederacy as a political entity by the late 17th century. But here is the deeper question that I think deserves your attention as we wrap this up. What does it mean that the English never understood what they were looking at? Wahunsenacah's marriage network was not primitive. It was a sophisticated political technology, one that had held together a confederacy of 30-plus groups across thousands of square miles for decades. The matrilineal system that English observers dismissed as strange was a system that gave women real structural power, real economic standing, and real leverage in the negotiations that shaped their lives. The bride wealth system that the English misread as commerce was actually a formal acknowledgement that a woman's labor and contribution had measurable worth. The English brought with them a framework in which wives were dependents, in which property passed through male lines, in which a chief's power came from God-given authority rather than from the patient weaving of family networks. They could not see the sophistication of what Wahunsenacah had built because they were looking for the wrong things. And that failure of vision, that inability to recognize complexity when it did not look familiar, had catastrophic consequences for the Powhatan people, consequences that echoed through generations. Before I sign off today, I want to give you something to think about. Wahunsenacah reportedly had over 100 wives across his lifetime. The English saw degeneracy. His own people saw the map of an empire, drawn not in ink but in family bonds, stretching from the Chesapeake Bay into the interior of a continent. Who was actually seeing clearly? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This kind of history deserves a real conversation, not just a like and a scroll. And if you found today's episode genuinely eye-opening, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who loves history. New episodes of Frontier Uncensored drop regularly, and trust me, the stories we have lined up are going to hit just as hard as this one. I am Dustin. This is Frontier.